A naked bike ride as hundreds of riders made their trek across the city to outside the ICE building to gain attention, sending a message they don't want the president to deploy the National Guard in Portland.
America, we need to talk about what's happening at ICE facilities across the country because what I'm seeing is absolutely insane. In Chicago, they built a fence around the ICE facility to keep white liberal protesters from interfering with immigration enforcement. And honestly, it's about time. Meanwhile, in Portland, hundreds of people are riding bikes, get this, completely naked to protest immigration enforcement. But here's what really gets me. While our government is trying to enforce our laws, these unemployed activists are turning serious policies into a circus.
This fence stands as a symbol of division. This fence is a symbol of dividing families. This fence is a symbol of dividing communities. This fence is a symbol of dividing Americans.
What is up, guys? Tyson De La Cruz here. Thank you so much for rocking with me. This story perfectly illustrates the difference between people who want to enforce our laws and the people who have nothing better to do than to dress up like cartoon characters and ride bikes naked. Let's start off with what's happening in Broadview, Illinois, just outside Chicago. The Department of Homeland Security erected a fence around a ICE processing facility. And you know what? Good. It's about time somebody put up barriers to keep these white liberal protesters from interfering with federal operations.
And this fence is a symbol of denying American constitutional rights. We must pull back all of these fences and all of these barriers to the American dream.
Illinois House Speaker Emanuel Chris Welch is out here crying about this fence, comparing it to the Berlin Wall. You know what the difference is? The Berlin Wall was built to keep trapped people under communism. The fence is built to keep protesters from disturbing federal agents who are trying to enforce American immigration law. I'm all for it. These protesters have been so disruptive, so aggressive that ICE agents can't even do their job safely. So yeah, put up the fence, block them out, let the professionals do their work without having to deal with a bunch of unemployed activists screaming at them all day.
Illinois State Police say they made 15 arrests outside the ICE facility in Broadview today as protesters clashed with officers.
Look at this, 15 arrests in one day. These aren't peaceful protesters exercising their First Amendment rights. These are people actively interfering with law enforcement operations. They're clashing with officers, disrupting federal business, and creating public safety hazards. The fence isn't the problem. The protesters are the problem. And if it takes a fence to keep them from obstructing federal immigration enforcement, then build the fence higher.
This decision was made to protect lives. It's been only by God's grace that no one has been seriously injured or killed as protesters dart into traffic on that busy 4-lane street.
The mayor of Broadview had to restrict where protests can happen because these people were literally running into traffic. Think about that. They are so unhinged, so desperate for attention, so desperate to disrupt immigration enforcement that they are endangering their own lives and the lives of innocent drivers. This is exactly why the fence is necessary. When you have people who are willing to run into traffic just to interfere with federal operations, you need physical barriers to protect everyone involved. Now here's where it gets interesting. You got Congressman Raja, Senators Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin, all demanding access to this facility, claiming that they have some constitutional right to inspect it.
We have the right, without giving any notice, to inspect any ICE detention facility. This particular Broadview facility, in my opinion, would qualify as a detention facility, whatever name they call.
But here's what they're not telling you. This isn't some secret detention center. This is a processing facility where people, get this, who entered our country illegally are being processed for deportation. That is exactly what should happen when somebody breaks our immigration laws. These politicians are trying to create drama where it doesn't even exist. They're acting like there's some conspiracy, some type of cover-up, when really it's just bureaucratic processing of people who shouldn't even have been here in the first place.
We must ask, what must be going on inside this ICE detention center that is so horrid, so inhumane, that they won't allow ministers to pray and to accompany those in need?
Listen to this rhetoric. What must be going on inside that is so horrid and so inhumane? They're creating a conspiracy theory about a federal facility that's simply doing its job. They want to bring in ministers to pray for people who chose to break American law. You know who needs prayers? American citizens dealing with the consequences of mass illegal immigration. Legal immigrants who followed the rules and are now competing with people who cut in line. Communities struggling with the costs of housing, the cost of education, and providing services to people who shouldn't even be here. But we already know this. These politicians don't care about any of that. They're more concerned about the comfort of lawbreakers than the impact of law-abiding Americans. Meanwhile, President Trump tried to deploy the National Guard to provide additional security around these facilities, and guess what happened? Liberal judges blocked it.
Today, a federal appeals court upheld a ruling blocking the Trump administration from deploying the National Guard in the Chicago area. But the court says the troops can remain federalized while the case is appealed.
So let me get this straight. We have protesters so violent, so disruptive that federal agents need a fence to do their job safely. We have people getting arrested by the dozens, running into traffic, clashing with police. But when the president tries to provide additional security through the National Guard, liberal judges say no. This is exactly the kind of judicial activism that's been undermining law enforcement for years. These judges care more about protecting the rights of the protesters to interfere with federal operations than they do about protecting federal agents trying to do their job.
This is an intentional attack by this president to divide and separate our communities. But he has finally met his match in the greatest freaking city in the world, the city of Chicago.
Illinois attorney called blocking the National Guard a victory for our state. A victory? They're celebrating the fact that federal agents have to work in dangerous conditions while trying to enforce immigration law. And he calls Chicago the greatest city in the world while it's dealing with massive crime, budget deficits, and population exodus. This is the same city that can't protect its own citizens from gang violence, but they're worried about protecting people who entered the country illegally. The Justice Department said the National Guard is needed to protect federal officers from violent attacks. That is not political rhetoric. That's operational reality. But liberal politicians and judges would rather see federal agents endangered than admit that these protesters have gotten out of control.
And more changes are on the way in Broadview. Protesting right outside that facility is about to look a little bit different than it has in recent weeks over the next coming days.
And the changes come as the deadline to remove the fencing is quickly approaching.
Now let's talk about keeping it weird, Portland, because what's happening there is absolutely insane. Hundreds of people participated in what they called an emergency naked bike ride to protest potential National Guard deployment.
So demonstrators pedaled along the streets wearing almost nothing in an emergency edition of the annual World Naked Bike Ride. Well, the bike ride is an annual tradition, usually taking place in the summer, but organizers hastily put together another nude ride to speak out against attempts to mobilize troops.
Let me ask you guys something. What does riding a bike naked have to do with immigration policy? What does public nudity have to do with ICE enforcement? This isn't a protest. This is attention-seeking behavior disguised as political activism. These people are so desperate for relevance, so starving for attention, that they'll take their clothes off in public and call it political resistance. It is absolutely pathetic. And it gets even weirder. They have something called Operation Inflation, where they're giving away inflatable costumes. We're talking about chickens, frogs, unicorns to protest.
Donald Trump is trying to say that this is a war zone, that Donald Trump is trying to say that he wants to invoke the Insurrection Act. He wants to send troops down here to squash the terrorists. And we want to make it clear that this is not a war zone, and that if he wants to invoke the Insurrection Act, he's going to have to point at people in in inflatable chickens and inflatable frogs and inflatable unicorns.
This is Portland's brilliant strategy. Dress up like cartoon characters and ride bikes naked to prove that Portland isn't a war zone. But here's what Portland doesn't seem to understand. The fact that you have time to organize naked bike rides and dress up in inflatable costumes proves exactly what I've been saying about these protesters. These people don't have jobs. They don't have responsibilities. They don't have families to support or businesses to run. They have so much free time that they can spend their days riding bikes naked and dressing up like farm animals.
The naked bike ride's always about showing the vulnerability of like the cyclists, and really we're kind of like, this time there's more about showing the vulnerability of our citizens.
Showing the vulnerability of our citizens. What vulnerability is that? The vulnerability of people who entered our country illegally are now facing consequences? That's not vulnerability. That is accountability. The real vulnerability is what American citizens face when we don't enforce immigration laws. But these protesters don't care about that. They're more concerned with protecting lawbreakers than protecting law-abiding Americans. And here's what really gets me about all this. While these protesters are playing dress up and riding bikes naked, real Americans are at work, paying taxes and dealing with actual consequences of our broken immigration system.
About 2 hours ago, hundreds of naked bike riders actually rode their bikes here in front of the ICE facility. And moments ago, around 50 pro-Trump and pro-ICE supporters have also arrived here.
Who shows up to counter-protest? Working Americans who support ICE and support immigration enforcement. People who understand that we need laws and we need to enforce them. People who have jobs and responsibilities and still take the time out of their day to support law enforcement. And what happens when they show up? The anti-ICE protesters attack them, because that's what these people do. They can't handle any opposition to their worldview, so they resort to violence and intimidation.
They'll be displaying those signs saying that we support ICE, we support the mission, and they'll be showing those signs towards the agents, and the agents will actually throw thumbs up back at the supporters.
Federal agents on the roof of the ICE facility giving the thumbs up to pro-ICE protesters. Why? Because they're grateful that somebody in the community supports them for doing their job. Think about that for a second. Federal agents who are just trying to enforce immigration law are so isolated, so under attack, that they're grateful for any sign of support. That tells you everything you need to know about how hostile the environment has become for law enforcement. These agents are just trying to do their job, enforcing laws that Congress passed and the president signed. But they're treated like villains by protesters who have nothing better to do than dress up in costumes and ride bikes naked.
We find that it's extremely important to be out here to show the federal government, especially Trump, we are not afraid. We are not afraid of this presence. And we're here to stand up against ICE.
We are not afraid of this presence. What presence? Federal agents are doing their jobs. The rule of law, they're literally saying they're not afraid of law enforcement, which tells you everything you need to know about their mindset. They're openly opposing immigration enforcement, openly defying federal authority, and they think they're heroes for doing it. But what they're really doing is making it harder and more expensive to enforce our immigration laws, which ultimately hurts everyone. Let's talk about what this is really costing American taxpayers. Every minute that federal agents spent dealing with these protesters is a minute that they're not spending processing deportations. Every dollar that goes to security and crowd control is a dollar that is not going to actual immigration enforcement. These protesters think that they're helping immigrants, but they're actually making the system less effective and more expensive. They're creating delays, increasing costs, and making it harder for ICE to actually do their job effectively. And meanwhile, we're spending billions of dollars housing, feeding, and processing people who shouldn't even be here in the first place. Instead of supporting efforts to enforce our laws and secure our borders, we have protesters demanding that we make it easier for people to break our immigration laws.
Portland PD here has issued several warnings telling the crowd to clear out the roads or they will be subject to arrest. We continue to see the clashes of federal agents, them attempting to clear out the driveway here.
Look at this. Portland police having to issue warnings to clear the roads. Federal agents having to clear their own driveways. This is what happens when you allow protesters to run wild without consequences. But here's the thing. The fence in Chicago shows that there's a solution. When you put up physical barriers, when you restrict access, when you don't allow protesters to interfere with federal operations, the system works better. In my opinion, the fence isn't a symbol of division. It's a symbol of order. It's a symbol that we're serious about enforcing our laws and protecting the people who enforce them. This isn't just about immigration. This is about a complete breakdown of respect for law and order in liberal cities. We have people that think if they disagree with the law, they can just ignore it or actively obstruct its enforcement. But here's what they don't seem to understand. We are a nation of laws, and these laws apply to everyone. You don't get to pick and choose which laws you want to follow based on your political beliefs. The fence in Chicago is a perfect example of how to handle this problem. Instead of allowing protesters to disrupt federal operations indefinitely, you put up barriers, you restrict access, you make it clear that law enforcement comes first, not the feelings of protesters.
Donald Trump is trying to say that this is a war zone, that Donald Trump is trying to say that he wants to invoke the Insurrection Act. He wants to send troops down here to squash the terrorists.
They're mocking the idea that Portland is a war zone while literally describing federal agents as stormtroopers and comparing immigration enforcement to fascism. They literally cannot see the irony of their own rhetoric. The truth is, these protesters have created a war zone, not because of federal agents doing their job, but because of protesters who refuse to respect the law and the people who enforce it. The solution isn't to give in to their demands or to try to accommodate their protests. The solution is what Chicago did. Put up a fence, restrict access, and let law enforcement do their job. America, this is what we're dealing with. We have federal agents who need fences to do their job safely, and liberal politicians complaining about those fences. We have courts blocking efforts to provide security for law enforcement. We have protesters riding bikes naked and dressing up like cartoon characters, thinking they're making some type of profound political statement. But you know what? The fences in Chicago gives me hope. It shows that when you're serious about law enforcement, when you're willing to put up barriers against those who obstruct justice, the system can work. We need more fences. We need more restrictions on protesters who interfere with federal operations. We need to support the men and women who are trying to enforce our immigration laws, not people trying to stop them. The bottom line is this: if your idea of political protest is riding a bike naked or dressing up like an inflatable chicken, maybe you should spend less time protesting and more time finding a job. And if you're interfering with federal agents trying to enforce our laws, you deserve whatever barriers they put up to keep you away. Let me know what you think about this. Drop it down in the comment section down below. Smash the like button if you kindly would. Share, subscribe, and as always, guys, I'll catch you on the next one.